everybody seems to understand the portrait. It is the most understand. You don't need language, you don't need explanation. With children, you don't need anything. They sit there, you draw, the excitement of them in the drawing. Their mothers understand what's just after happening. Everybody knows that this is the valuing of the person. So I was in the Tech in '68 and began to get politicised. The Springbok rugby team, the South African rugby team, came to stay in our town, the small town, and they stayed in the local hotel. And we decided that they wouldn't get a night's sleep because it was very clear the church, the priests at the time, the hoteliers, the police, they all lined up on the side of the South African rugby football team. And on the other side were the Republicans, were the communists, etc. But I did become involved in non-violent resistance, which was our policy in the North. It changed for a couple of years in reaction to the violence of the state. And the war continued for 30 years. We were not that involved in it. And in the end it was resolved along the lines that we had thought possible then. But it took 30 years and 3,000 people to die before the conditions were right for the Good Friday Agreement. That was my youthful experience. When I was in college, I was involved, mostly I was suspended or expelled. We mounted a resistance against the academy. And first of all, it was about the quality of teaching, and then it was about the right to speak, and eventually I qualified. And that was the one way of getting rid of me, was to give me a degree. But it was funny years later to go back and take over that college and be in charge. It was like unfinished business in my 50s from my 20s. But as I said, I stopped drinking. I'd been drinking to excess and stuff, and began to re-establish myself. And the one thing I was able to do was this. Whether it was good or bad at it is another question, but I was able to do it. I'd been trained to it. So I began to paint, and the first thing I did was my own story. And then after I painted my own story, I began to paint the stories of the people around me, in Dublin and that. I ended up teaching in prison for most of my, I went in in 80, I went in when I was about 35 years of age. The Arts Council asked me to go into the prison. It's a very human story. There was a prison break by the IRA. They blew 21 gates. There were 22. They didn't get away. And as a result of that, anything used in the break was removed from prisoners. And that included their watches. Timing was part of the process. And it was taken from everybody. Now, there were prisoners there who were not in the IRA and weren't part of the escape, but they lost their watches. One of them was a man serving 40 years. And he was doing open university and studies. And when they took his watch, he said, "Fuck it, I've had it. I'm not doing any more of this education stuff. If I can't be able to time my, day, my work. I'm not doing it. The guy in charge of education felt for this man. The man had a 40-year sentence. It's a long time to spend in a small room. If you withdraw from education, what are you left with? And out of desperation, which is common enough in administrative and educational circles, when they're stuck and they can't get any movement, they call the artist as a last resort. So, as a last resort, I did the job. I got that man painted, and we became very good friends. He didn't serve 40 years. He proved that his conviction was false, and after 15 he came out, and I know the man still. That's why I was asked to go in, and I figured as long as I could get Peter involved in art, I could do anything I liked in the place. And so I did. We started working with the IRA prisoners and other associated Republican prisoners. And then later, I said, fuck this. There's a whole load of drug dealers on the ground floor and bank robbers and the social prisoners. I said, in many ways, I was close to their class. So I went down and started working with them and became very close to a number. And I did 20 years teaching. And it has become a method that I usually, if I can go to any prison, I've been all over the world, I've been in, run programs in prisons, short programs, anything from day long to 3 weeks. In different prisons. I found that you could enter parts of society through the prison in a way that you couldn't otherwise. Particularly in a trade or this painter's game is colonized by the middle class. Like with a totality that marches power in step. So you're removed from other classes. But one way of countering that is to work in prisons. And eventually I was picked to go into the Biennale in São Paulo. And because I had politics, class politics, the curator figured that if you're going to send someone there, that they need to have that quality. And it's true, I had class politics when I got, and I also had experience of working in the prisons in Ireland, so I was able to go into them in Brazil. I heard that there were 50,000 people from Europe went to the opening of the São Paulo Biennale. But the 2 million from São Paulo went to it. So I said, fuck, I think I'll do the job for the 2 million. And then, of course, I wanted to bring the favela to the Biennale. And I wanted to bring the prison to the Biennale. I just wanted to bring all the places I was familiar with at home. I wanted to bring, and so I did that. I went on a tour of Europe, and I went up to Germany, and then I called Ed Kienholz, whose work I'd seen in Dublin, which had astounded me. It had completely, I had never seen anything that it was equivalent to Mein Kampf in art terms, the impact of it. I called on him, and he took the visit. Well, he kind of took the visit. He came downstairs and said he was going to go to the hardware store to buy a screwdriver. Innocently, I believed him. I sat in the car, and whatever I did in the car, I talked about my father, because at the hardware store, whatever way I behaved, I was invited upstairs to the studio, and I met Nancy, and they looked at my work, and they tried to buy some of it. It had already been sold, but in the end, I went to them throughout the 80s, every year, and they bought a work from me. And we became friends. They were the one link I had to something else, which didn't define me in terms of where I came from or anything. It just accepted me as I am. They invited me in, after the wall came down, they invited me to go over to Idaho in the summers, where they had established, they bought the schoolhouse and they turned the top of it into 4 apartments, and they would invite artists to use the apartments and make work in the summer. And I ended up doing that for 25 years. And I go there every August. So that was, in a sense, became part of my year, was going to America. And it resulted in shows, because I was there and showed my work and talked to people. So anyway, the international element of my work came through this friendship with Kleinholz. He introduced me to Houston. I worked in Houston. I established a knowledge base of people I knew. So when I read the story of the women being killed in Juárez, here we had brown, female, young, factory workers. You know, on any of those 4 criteria, they are below in the class structure of society. And I said, you know, this is what I do. I tell these type of stories. So I went to Houston. I found someone there who introduced me to someone in Juárez, and suddenly I'm in people's kitchens, hearing the story of their daughter, and I started making the paintings and so on. And that's led to this work here, all this work in this room. Syria came from, I was reading about Syria in the papers, and it didn't fit. There's something fucking wrong. It didn't make sense to me. So I wanted to go and find out myself. Orwell talks about how in war you can believe nothing, but you might believe what you see, but because you see only such a small segment, even that's under trouble. So I take that on board, but I still went to Syria. I spent a lot of time in Juárez. Remember, I talked to you about being a kid going to England to work under my brother's papers. That was my experience. These men here that died, their bones are in the desert. That's all they were doing. Going to a different country to work under false papers. Look at them. Look at the remains. This business of, you know, like I'm an artist, the most irrelevant fucking person you can find in one level. I don't bring food, I don't bring heat, I don't bring buildings. But I do bring a pencil and a piece of paper, and I do sit in front of you and I make a drawing of you, whether you're in jail or whether you're in a refugee camp in the middle of the South Sudan or wherever you are in Aleppo. everybody seems to understand the portrait. It is the most understand. You don't need language, you don't need explanation. With children, you don't need anything. They sit there, you draw, the excitement of them in the drawing. Their mothers understand what's just after happening. Everybody knows that this is the valuing of the person. That's what it is. I mean, it was a big contradiction for me in jail to make portraits, painted portraits of men who are being locked away, and you wouldn't be able to talk about them in the newspaper or stuff, but they couldn't talk about themselves. And here we were, celebrating their individuality in the middle of these fucking barbed wires. It's a contradiction. We were shifting. We were shifting the reality just a tiny bit. It was resistance of it. The making of the portraits, it was a form of resistance rather than the celebration of wealth, which is where the formal portrait belongs. So yeah, somewhere in the mix of that lies the value of a human being being equal